thank you for joining us in this presentation entitled Is Social Media Bad for People? The 2021 Storming of the US Capitol Complex. My name is Yannis Stavrakakis. I am from the School of Computer Science of the Technological University of Dublin in Ireland, and I have the pleasure to introduce you to the work that my colleagues Damien Gordon, Dimna O'Sullivan, Andrea Carley, and myself have put together regarding the relatively recent horrendous storming of the US Capitol Complex in Washington, D.C., and the role of social media. We'll start with a brief history of the event. On Wednesday, January 6, 2021, former US President Donald Trump was scheduled to speak at a Save America Pro-Trump rally near the White House. Trump had tweeted extensively about the event. During his speech, President Trump emphasized his claim that the election had been stolen, a thing he's been repeating since the 2020 US presidential election. At the end of his speech, he urged the crowd to march to the Capitol building, where lawmakers had gathered to count the Electoral College votes. His words were, "We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue, and we're going to the Capitol." Here are some of the photos published by the media on that day. You might have already seen many or all of them already. Pay particular attention to the horned Viking character in the middle of the second row. He's a recurring conspiracy theory celebrity figure in the canon circles and was one of the rioters that were arrested by police following these events. The aftermath of the riot. 6 hours after the storming of the building, the senators went back in. Unfortunately, 5 people were killed, including 1 police officer. 193 people were arrested. Of those, 94% were white and 86% male. 66% were older than 34 years old. 85% were employed. 10% were affiliated with militias and or other violent right-wing groups. And 1% was associated with gangs. For this riot were myriad, including to protest the outcomes of the presidential election and 2 Senate elections, and to prevent the counting of the electoral votes that formally certify the election result. These events will be analyzed and reflected upon for years to come, and blame will be placed at many agents' doors. Inevitably, one that has already been singled out is social media, including Facebook and Twitter, the primary communication media of President Donald Trump. All social media platforms are currently under heavy scrutiny. Prior to the riot, the protesters used social media platforms to organize their dissent on the result of the elections. A recent study found disconcerting content on both platforms, Twitter and Parler, and noted that a significant proportion of traffic on Parler was in support of undermining the veracity of the 2020 US presidential elections, as well as hate speech as a result of Parler's relaxed community guidelines. By Fuchs suggests that because Donald Trump used the image of a boxer and told them to fight like hell, he communicated to his followers that a battle was needed, and his supporters chanted on their way to and inside of the Capitol, "Fight for Trump." But the study also highlights that it was not a single speech that incited a coup, but a long chain of events that unfolded as a consequence of Trump's authoritarian ideology, authoritarian personality, and authoritarian practices. Another study highlights the fact that on the day of the riot, Donald Trump tweeted, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously, viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long," and suggests that these types of tweets create a perception of moral homogeneity and a moral obligation to defend the in-group even by radical means. It's an intricate issue. The interactions on social media can sometimes make susceptible people think that a celebrity or politician is speaking directly to them, which can be empowering, but can also have deleterious effects on the individual, where the distinction between the virtual and real world become blurred. This can also blur the differentiation between public spaces and private spaces. This delusional perception of direct communication also leads to the creation of divides between in-groups and out-groups based on very simplistic criteria, such as gender, race, and social status. This, in combination with the anonymity of identity that platforms like Facebook and Twitter allow their users, can lead to harassment and bullying online, as well as sharing untrue content without potentially damaging their self-image or social relationships. This by itself wouldn't be as problematic as the fact that Facebook and Twitter also recommend people to follow based partially on commonly shared interests to create filter bubbles and echo chambers, increasing affective polarization between users of different ideological, political, and otherwise preferences. All of this invariably leads to groupthink, where people feel they have to behave in a particular way because they think that everyone that they are friends with are behaving in that way. The 2018 study identified 6 ways that social media systems are a threat to democracy. Echo chambers, polarization, and hyper-partisanship is one. Spread of false and or misleading information, conversion of popularity into legitimacy, manipulation by populist leaders, governments, and fringe actors, personal data capture and targeted messaging advertising, and disruption of the public space. In the short time that social media have been in existence, the relationship with politics has seen exponential growth in the last decade. Many scholars have been studying the role that modern technology has been playing in preventing traditional information gatekeepers from controlling dissident speech. All the above, however, not to suggest or imply that social media is all bad. In fact, it can be used for a range of positive cases, and it is worth noting that during the riot, social media was indeed used to support victims and inform law enforcement personnel of the ongoing developments. One example of how social media were used to empower people against oppressive governments is the Tahrir Square uprising and the Arab Spring of 2011. Starting in Tunisia in December 2010 and then in Egypt in January 2011, a chain of events took place that led to the ousting of a number of authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. The protests spread in about 20 countries in the region. The protesters used the internet and platforms such as Facebook to organize and promote public protest events. The Egyptian authorities, in an attempt to restrict outgoing information from the country, cut off the internet and mobile phone service. This caused a surge of international attention to Egypt, and some tech-savvy protesters managed to break through this barrier and use the internet to give interviews and send updates to international news and agencies. This was a pro-democratic revolution which sparked through the internet and social media. The people used the internet and social media to organize and coordinate pro-democratic civic actions to topple an oppressive regime that at the time had no understanding of the power of social media. Many looked at this moment hoping that social media would be a liberating force for the good of the people. The result was that Egypt's authoritarian leader Hosni Mubarak was ousted, but in an ironic way, he was replaced by a military regime which, understanding the power of social media, started using it to organize pro-government forces using propaganda, while at the same time dividing the revolutionary forces and polarizing the public. Many social scientists and technologists consider this an important historical moment. Tufekci wrote about this event in 2010. Power always learns, and powerful tools always fall into its hands. This is a hard lesson of history, but a solid one. It is key to understanding how in 7 years, digital technologies have gone from being hailed as tools of freedom and change to being blamed for upheavals in Western democracies, for enabling increased polarization, rising authoritarianism, and meddling in national elections by Russia and others. Now let's see some facts about the evolution of social media. In the 2008 US presidential election, almost a quarter of voters under 30 years old found information about political campaigns on social media. Pew Research Center found that in 2018, social media usage increased in all age groups, peaking at 88% for 18 to 29-year-olds and at 37% for those over 65. Approximately around 53% of Americans had been civically active in 2018 on social media. In 2020, on average, 55% of American social media users were found to be worn out by political posts and discussions online. In the same year, 54% of Americans thought that social media companies should not allow political ads on their platforms. A 2021 finding shows that 70% of US social media users never or rarely post or share about political and other social issues. In the span of a decade, social media went from largely being a youth phenomenon to becoming an established information-sharing platform in the US and other parts of the world. Social media platforms use tools like endless scrolling, likes, followers, recommendation algorithms, and others to persuade users to stay and spend more of their attention in the content provided. At the same time, the platforms collect a multitude of data points from their users to accurately promote content that will increase their engagement with the platform and paid ads. The data collected on users are so many that enable platforms' AI systems to make eerily accurate predictions on things like user personality traits and political affiliation, and promote content that fits these user profiles. This has as a consequence the creation of filter bubbles, where each user sees different things according to their preferences. This is practically a way to manipulate users in spending as much time as possible on these platforms. But this is not the only manipulation taking place in this environment. Here are some other examples. In 2016, the Trump presidential campaign hired Cambridge Analytica, a consulting firm, to harvest data from over 87 million Facebook users by creating a quiz that not only acquired the data of those who took the quiz, but also the data of their friends on the platform. This became an international scandal when it was revealed a few years back. Later findings showed that Facebook was aware of this and failed to act. Another example are the Russian trolls that interfered with the 2016 US election on social media, the pro-Leave Twitter bots and their role in the Brexit campaign of 2016, and the recently revealed Facebook loophole allowing state-backed manipulation in several small, poor, non-Western countries. President Trump's tweets are a classic example of social media manipulation and disinformation. Some platforms like Twitter took action and started to indicate fraudulent or misinformative posts like the ones shown here. Studies have shown that the spreading of disinformation through social media pushes domestic terrorism mainly via the increasing political polarization. What is more, other studies show that social media have been weaponized by state and non-state actors for information warfare. However, social media companies do have tools and personnel to help monitor and remove contentious or libelous postings. And they use a combination of artificial intelligence and professional moderators to review and remove these postings. But there are some issues. There are issues with the moderation process. The scale of the task is enormous. The moderators are often hired based on the lowest salary. They may lack knowledge on the platform-specific guidelines, as well as the linguistic fluency in the language of the content. And they also have issues with the notoriously inconsistent application by social media platforms of their own norms of acceptable speech. So back to January 6th and the next day. What happened after January 6th? Trump's accounts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube were suspended. Twitter also suspended accounts linked to the far-right platform Canon, which is linked with Trump. Parler, the right-wing extremist platform used by Trump supporters, was banned by Google and Apple, and its web hosting was suspended by Amazon. And other online platforms such as Pinterest, Reddit, etc. followed by taking similar actions. So now what? Floridi recently wrote a piece that argues that social media companies did the right thing this time. However, these actions bring to the surface some more issues. In Floridi's words, the crucial variable is time. Today, the social media companies did the right thing. But tomorrow, societies should not depend on companies doing the right thing if and when they wish, independently of any rules and democratic accountability. The real problem was not Trump, soon out of the game, but that the decision to silence a voice, no matter how problematic, was left to corporate discretion. He suggests that it is time to take seriously the fact that the infosphere is humanity's commons and hence regulate its use with open and transparent rules, legally grounded on all human rights and on human dignity, to avoid arbitrariness, unaccountability, abuse and discrimination. One must remember that the companies that suspended Trump are also part of the problem, not just the solution, because they are also the ones who first empowered and then disempowered such a demagogue through their platform. So what are the next steps? Teaching computing ethics to computer science students looks like an important step. The issues mentioned here are of great concern and are only some of a rapidly growing number of computing ethics issues that have been emerging recently. At this point, I would like to mention that TU Dublin is part of the Ethics for EU Erasmus Plus project, where a number of third-level institutes across Europe are collaborating to explore some of these key ethical challenges and to develop educational content that is both based on pedagogically sound principles and motivated by international exemplars of best practice to highlight these matters. One specific development that is being undertaken is the creation of a lesson focusing on the ethics of developing software that can have a negative impact on people's lives. If you want to find out more about this, please come to our live talk on this during the conference. The teaching of computing ethics to computer science students and technologists is undoubtedly important. However, extreme political events, such as the violent events that took place in the US Capitol complex, bring to the forefront some equally important issues that should be discussed along with the ethics of computing. These are the political economy of the Internet as a digital public space with private spaces, the Internet as a digital country that should have laws, values, culture, etc., ethical and legal frameworks, legality and political values, the economic and financial models and company policies, and maybe it's time to aim for an ethically and legally acceptable ecology in the infosphere. I would like to thank you for your attention.